The Zelthari ship moved without sound through the black sky above Earth, the way a shadow moves across still water, slow and sure and completely unbothered by anything below it. The ship was long and pale and shaped like a blade, and it carried inside it 43 of the most capable military minds in the known galaxy. These were not young soldiers on their first mission. They were veterans. They had walked on the surfaces of worlds that smelled like iron and blood, worlds where the sky came down in colors no name existed for, and they had always left those worlds quieter than they found them. Commander Vel-Sereth stood at the observation window and looked down at the blue and green planet below him. He had seen many planets like this from above, full of water, full of life, full of creatures that believed themselves to be important. He always found it a little sad, in the professional way a carpenter might find it sad to look at a tree that was still standing. Away from the window, and walked to the operations table, where his senior xenobiologist, a tall and careful woman named Orveth, was spreading her reports across the surface. She worked with neat hands, and she always smelled faintly of the chemical preservatives she used in her lab. "Tell me what we have," Vel-Sereth said. Orveth tapped the table, and the images came up, photographs and biological readings pulled from weeks of silent drone observation. The drones had been flying low over forests, savannas, oceans, and mountain ranges for 32 days, cataloging every creature that moved. They had been so quiet and so small that nothing on the ground had noticed them, not even the large ones. "The planet has a significant number of apex predators," Orveth said, "which is not unusual for a biosphere of this age and complexity. We have identified and prioritized the primary threats." She brought up the list. At the top was the lion, a large social predator with strong group hunting behavior and enough weight behind a strike to break bones without effort. Vel-Sereth had dealt with creatures like this before on other worlds. He was not worried. Below it was the wolf, smaller, but deeply coordinated, the kind of creature that made up for what it lacked in size by never stopping, never losing the trail, never forgetting a smell. Below that came the saltwater crocodile, the great white shark, the spotted hyena, the Cape buffalo, the grizzly bear, and a few others that Orveth had flagged as secondary concerns. Each one had a squad assigned to it. Each squad had a plan. "How long?" Vel-Sereth asked. 8 days for primary suppressions, Orveth said. 14 if we include secondary zones and ocean operations. The fleet can begin positioning on day 10 as you approve the timeline. Vel-Sereth nodded. He approved the timeline. This was the part of the job he found most straightforward. Planets had animals. The animals needed to be dealt with before human, or in this case, pre-interstellar, populations were managed. The animals were never the hard part. The animals were simply the first step. Orveth began rolling up her reports, and as she did, one of her junior analysts, a young male named Druvitt, who had only been on 2 prior missions, raised his hand from the far end of the table. "There is one creature I flagged in the preliminary notes," Druvitt said. He pulled up a photograph on his personal screen. A small, low-to-the-ground animal with coarse black and white fur, a flat, heavy body, and short, strong legs. It was sitting in the middle of a dirt clearing, chewing something that appeared to still be moving, and it was looking directly at the drone camera, with eyes that held absolutely nothing in them. No fear, no curiosity, no reaction of any kind. It was looking at the drone the way a stone looks at rain. "Mellivora capensis," Druvitt said, reading from his notes. "Common name, honey badger. It is a small mammal, native to Africa and parts of Asia. Maximum weight approximately 14 kilograms. It is classified by the local biological records as a mustelid, related to weasels and otters." He paused. "But some of the behavioral data is unusual. I wanted to flag it before." Orveth looked at the photograph, and then looked at Druvitt. "It weighs 14 kilograms, she said. "Yes, but the behavioral. Our primary target, the lion, weighs 200 kilograms, and runs at 80 kilometers per hour, Orveth said. The saltwater crocodile weighs over 1,000 kilograms and has a bite force that can bend steel. The grizzly bear weighs 500 kilograms and has been recorded tearing open reinforced wooden structures with its forelimbs. She looked at the photograph one more time. That is a small, furry animal, eating something in a field. Drovet opened his mouth. "Delete the entry," Orveth said, and went back to her reports. The photograph, for a moment longer. He looked at those flat black eyes, and felt something move in the back of his mind. Something quiet and cautious, like a small animal, sensing a change in the air. Then he deleted the entry. Down below in a dry stretch of land, where the ground was pale orange and cracked at the edges, and the sun pushed down with both hands, the honey badger finished whatever it had been eating. It stood up, scratched one ear with a back foot, and began moving through the grass with a low rolling walk that looked lazy but covered ground with surprising speed. It had no awareness of the ship in the sky. It had no awareness of the reports being filed or the squads being assigned. It did not know that 43 of the most capable military minds in the known galaxy had looked at a photograph of it and decided it was not worth their time. It did not know any of this. It would not have cared if it did. A scorpion moved out from under a flat rock, near the honey badger's path. The honey badger stopped, looked at it, and then bit its head off, with the casual efficiency of something that has never in its life entertained the idea that something might bite back in a way that mattered. It ate the scorpion and kept walking. On the ship above, Vel-Sareth signed the operation order. The suppressions would begin at first light on the following day. The primary squads were ready. The secondary squads were briefed. The timeline was locked. The planet below was already, in every way that the commander was able to calculate, as good as managed. He went to his quarters and slept without dreaming. The honey badger walked through the dark, without sleeping at all. The first morning of operations was clean and efficient, and went exactly the way Vel-Sareth expected it to go. Squad 1 deployed to the Serengeti before the sun finished rising. They moved in a wide, practiced arc through the tall grass, using pulse emitters that sent low vibrations through the ground, vibrations that confused the inner ear of most large mammals and made them walk in slow circles before their legs stopped working altogether. It was not painful. It was not meant to be. The Zelthari were not cruel. They were simply thorough. The lions went down in under an hour. 6 adult females, 2 males, and 4 juveniles, all sedated and loaded into the holding containers with care. The containers were temperature-controlled, and the air inside them was clean and measured. The squad leader filed his report before midday. Primary target suppressed, no complications, no injuries to personnel or subjects. It was the same story from Squad 2 in the Canadian forests. Wolves gave them more movement to deal with, a pack of 11 running hard in different directions the moment the vibrations started. But the squad had anticipated this and placed secondary emitters on all likely exit routes. The wolves were contained by midday as well. The crocodiles took longer, because water operations always took longer. But by late afternoon, Squad 4 was moving the last of the large ones into transport cases, while medics monitored their vitals from the bank of the river. Vel-Sareth reviewed the reports that evening with a cup of something warm and thin that he drank when he was satisfied. And he was satisfied. The planet was cooperating, the way planets always cooperated when the Zelthari knew what they were doing, and they always knew what they were doing. Day 1 complete, Orveth said, standing beside him at the operations table. Primary suppressions at 62%. Projected completion still on schedule. He did not look at the footnotes at the bottom of the report. He should have looked at the footnotes. The footnotes were where things had started to go sideways in ways that nobody had put together yet. Squad 3 had noted in their Day 1 report that their secondary equipment container had been found open that morning before deployment began. The latch was not broken. It had been worked open from the outside. The container held ration packs and 2 spare sedative canisters. The ration packs were gone. The canisters were still there, but had been rolled several meters from the container and punctured. Not cracked, not dented, but punctured cleanly by something with narrow, very strong teeth. The soldier who filed the note wrote at the bottom, "Small animal, likely opportunistic scavenging, no operational impact." Squad 6 had a different note. They had set up a perimeter of motion sensors around their forward camp the night before operations began. Morning. 3 of the sensors were no longer working. When a technician went to check them, she found that the wiring inside 2 of them had been chewed apart. Not pulled, not cut, but chewed, with the kind of patience that implied the animal had sat there for some time, doing it deliberately. She found paw prints in the soft dirt around the 3rd sensor. Small prints, low to the ground, with thick rounded toes. The sensor itself was intact, but had been flipped completely upside down. She filed this as possible interference by local fauna. Recommend checking perimeter materials for animal resistance. Squad 9 was the one with the strangest note of all. On their 2nd night of preparation work, one of their soldiers had heard something outside the supply tent and gone to investigate. He found a small animal sitting beside a torn-open food case, eating dried protein rations with the complete calm of an animal that had never been interrupted before and did not believe this. Counted as being interrupted either. He had shouted at it. It had looked at him. The soldier described the look in his report as, "The animal did not appear startled and did not retreat. It maintained visual contact for approximately 4 seconds and then returned to eating." The soldier had moved toward it, and the animal had made a sound, short, rough, coming from somewhere low in its chest, and the soldier had stopped moving. He was a trained Zelthari field operative who had been in combat situations on 3 separate worlds, and he had stopped moving because something about that sound made the part of his brain responsible for staying alive speak up before the part responsible for orders could get a word in. He wrote in his report, "Small mammal, low threat, no further action taken." None of these reports were connected to each other on the 1st day. None of them were connected to each other on the 2nd day either. Even though on the 2nd day, Squad 3 found their perimeter sensors had been moved again. Squad 6 lost a comm relay to what the technician described as targeted chewing of the primary cable housing. Unclear how the animal accessed the relay box, as it was mounted at 1.5 meters height. And Squad 9's soldier reported seeing the same small black and white animal again, this time on top of a storage crate. Watching the squad's medical officer perform a routine equipment check with what he described as apparent focused attention. Orveth reviewed the daily summaries that evening, and her eyes moved over the footnotes the way eyes move over fine print when they are looking for something specific and do not find it, and conclude therefore that nothing specific is there. "Any concerns?" Velsarith asked. "None," Orveth said. "Primary suppressions are at 89%. We are ahead of schedule." Velsarith nodded and finished his drink. On the ground below, in 3 separate locations spread across hundreds of kilometers, a small animal with flat black eyes and a rolling walk, and no concept whatsoever of what the words "low threat" meant, continued doing what it had been doing every night. It moved through camps that smelled of metal and chemicals and foreign biology. It tested things with its teeth. It learned the shape of things, the weight of things. It ate what it found useful, and ignored what it did not. It did not plan in the way that the Zelthari planned, with reports and timelines and projected completion dates. It operated on something older than planning, something that had been working without interruption for tens of millions of years, and had never once filed a footnote about it. The morning Velsarith met the honey badger began like all the other mornings had begun, with reports, coffee, and the comfortable assumption that things were proceeding according to plan. The suppressions were nearly complete. The lions were in holding. The wolves were in holding. The crocodiles, bears, and most of the secondary targets were either contained or had been moved off-world to designated biological storage facilities on the Zelthari survey station, 3 orbits out. The planet was getting quieter in the way Vel-Sareth liked, manageable, predictable, ready for the next phase. He had decided to walk the perimeter of the forward base himself that morning, not because anything was wrong, but because he was a commander who believed in using his own eyes. He had built his career on this habit, and it had never failed him. He pulled on his field jacket, picked up his suppression rod, standard issue, capable of dropping a creature up to 300 kilograms with a single pulse, and stepped out of the operations tent into the dry, orange morning. The forward base of Squad 7 was a tidy arrangement of supply containers, sleeping tents, equipment shelters, and sensor towers, set up in a flat, open area at the edge of the bush. The grass around it had been flattened, and the perimeter sensors were supposed to create an unbroken ring of coverage around the whole camp. He noticed immediately that one of the sensors on the eastern edge was dark. Its small indicator light, which should have been a steady green, was simply not there at all. He walked toward it, across the cracked ground. When he got close enough, he could see why the sensor was dark. The cable running from its base into the ground, a cable wrapped in double-layer reinforced polymer housing that the equipment manifest described as resistant to environmental damage and mechanical stress, had been chewed through. The cut was not ragged. It was thorough, had been worked on section by section, with something that had strong, narrow teeth, and apparently nothing else on its agenda that night. Vel-Sareth crouched down and looked at it. He turned the severed cable end in his fingers. He had seen equipment damaged by animals before. Gnaw marks were not unusual near campsites on biological worlds. But this was different. This was not an animal that had chewed on something by accident or out of curiosity. This was an animal that had found the cable and stayed with it until the cable stopped working. He stood up and turned around. The honey badger was sitting on top of the supply container 3 meters behind him. It was smaller than he had imagined a significant problem would be. It was low and thick, and the black and white coloring was stark in the morning light. Its front legs were short, and its claws, he noticed, were not small. Its face was flat and broad, and its eyes were the color of old coal, and they were pointed directly at him without any of the signals his training told him to look for in dangerous animals. No raised hackles, no bared teeth, no defensive posturing. It was just looking at him. The way something looks at you when it was there first and is waiting to see what you decide to do about it. Vel-Sareth had pacified 3 worlds. He had gone hand-to-hand with a creature on Vreth 5 that weighed 400 kilograms and had bone plates under its skin. He had crawled through the tunnel systems of the Drek Warrens on Mulgos without light or backup for 6 hours. He was not a soldier who panicked. He raised the suppression rod and pointed it at the honey badger. The honey badger did not move. It continued to look at him. The rod was set to the medium pulse, enough to drop a wolf, enough to make a leopard sleep for 2 hours, and Vel-Sareth fired it. The pulse hit the honey badger square in the chest. The honey badger blinked. It shook its head once. An animal shakes off water, and then it looked at him again. Vel-Sareth fired again, this time on the high setting. The high setting on a standard Zelthari suppression rod was rated for creatures up to 300 kilograms. It was not a setting used lightly. The honey badger stepped off the container, landed on all 4 feet, and walked toward him. What followed was the most undignified 11 minutes of Vel-Sareth's entire military career. He would later file a report on the incident, and the report would be detailed and clinical, because he was a professional, and professionals filed detailed clinical reports, even about things they would prefer to never think about again. But between the lines of the report, between the phrases, "Subject demonstrated unusual resistance to suppression pulse," and "Attempted manual containment was unsuccessful," and "Sustained minor lacerations to left forearm and right boot," was 11 minutes that no amount of. The honey badger was not large. It was not fast in the way that a lion is fast. It did not hit hard in the way that a bear hits hard. What it did was refuse. Every time Velsereth moved, it was already moving. The suppression rod hit it twice more at close range, and both times it shook the effect off in seconds. Its skin. He would note this in the report, and it would be read with some disbelief back on the ship. Its skin moved. When he grabbed at it, the loose, thick hide rolled and shifted under his hands, so that what he gripped was never quite where the animal under it was. The claws on its front feet were not decorative. At the 8-minute mark, Velsereth was standing with his back against the supply container, and one of his boots had a hole in it, and his forearm was bleeding in a way that was not dangerous, but was deeply annoying. And the honey badger was sitting in front of him, eating something it had found on the ground in the last 30 seconds, apparently having decided that the interaction was over. It ate with complete calm. It did not look at him again. It finished eating, stood up, turned around, and walked away into the grass in that low rolling walk that covered ground faster than it looked like it should. Velsereth stood against the container for a moment. He looked at his arm. He looked at his boot. He looked at the grass where the animal had disappeared. Then he went back to the operations tent and sat down and opened a Priority 1 channel to the ship. Orveth appeared on the screen within seconds, because Priority 1 channels were not used for small things. "Commander?" she said. And then she looked at his arm, and her expression changed. "Pull up the creature that Analyst flagged in the preliminary survey," Velsereth said, "the small one that was deleted." Orveth was quiet for a moment. "The mustelid?" "Yes." "Assessed as low threat," she said. "Pull it up," he said again. She pulled it up. Velsereth looked at the photograph, the squat black and white animal in the dirt field, eating something, looking at the drone camera with those flat coal eyes. "I want a full biological workup," he said. "I want behavioral analysis. I want every field note from every squad that mentioned unusual equipment damage or small animal contact in the last 6 days. I want them cross-referenced tonight." Orveth looked at him steady. "What happened?" Velsereth looked at the photograph one more time. "It did not go down," he said. "The briefing on the ship was not comfortable for anyone involved." Sub-Admiral Kethros stood at the head of the operations chamber and looked at the 12 soldiers assembled before him. They were the best the Dominion had sent to this planet. The task force assigned to handle situations that regular suppression squads were not equipped for. They had been used twice before on this mission, both times to deal with large territorial creatures that had required more than standard field protocols. They were accustomed to being called in for things that were large and dangerous. They were not accustomed to being called in for something that weighed 14 kilograms. Kethros had reviewed Velsereth's report 3 times. He had also reviewed the cross-referenced field notes that Orveth had compiled after the commander's request. 22 separate incidents across 6 squads over 6 days, all involving equipment damage or supply loss or unexplained contact with a small, black and white animal that nobody had thought to connect to anything until now. The notes painted a picture that was difficult to look at directly. He pulled up the footage. The footage was from the body camera Velsereth had been wearing during the encounter. It was 11 minutes, and the task force watched all of it without speaking. When it ended, Kethros stood in the silence for a moment, and then said, "Questions." One of the soldiers, a large male named Tervak, who had once kept fighting for 2 minutes after a bone in his leg broke during an operation on Duskworld 4, raised his hand. "The suppression rod was on high setting?" "Both times," Kethros said. Tervak nodded slowly and said nothing else. The briefing covered everything the biological workup had produced. The honey badger's skin was thick and loose in a way that made gripping and puncturing both significantly harder than with most animals of comparable size. to venom that was without parallel in any creature cataloged in the Xelthari biological database. It could survive the bite of snakes whose toxins were lethal to creatures 40 times its size, and be back on its feet within hours. Its pain response appeared to be functional, in the sense that it registered injury, but it did not appear to alter the animal's behavior in any meaningful way. It had been documented on this planet's own scientific record, rolling around after being bitten by venomous snakes, recovering, and then going back and eating the snake. Kethros had read that part of the report twice as well. "Our objective," Kethros said, "is containment for study and removal from the operational zone. The planet's suppression is otherwise complete, and the fleet is waiting on our clearance. We do not leave without resolving this." The task force deployed that afternoon in 2 vehicles, carrying upgraded containment equipment, reinforced capture nets with triple-layer polymer construction, sedative gas canisters rated for large predators, protective gear for close contact, and 3 backup suppression rods per operative. They found the honey badger within 4 hours. It was not hiding. It was moving across open ground near a dry riverbed, eating beetles out of the cracked earth, and paying no attention to anything around it. Day 1 of the operation lasted from mid-afternoon until dark. The reinforced net worked for approximately 40 seconds. The honey badger chewed through the edge of it, through a triple-layer polymer construction, before the team had finished tightening the cables. Turvak, who had prepared for this specifically, grabbed the animal with both hands and the thick gloves, and the animal rolled in his grip like water finding a different direction. And when it was done rolling, Turvak had a hand that worked fine, but felt like it had been put in something that ground things. And Turvak had faced a broken leg on Duskworld 4. Not make a sound, but he did let go. The sedative gas worked in the sense that the animal inhaled it and slowed down for a period of approximately 3 minutes before standing up and walking away from the cloud, with the expression, Turvak wrote in his report, of something that had been mildly inconvenienced by bad weather. They contained it on day 2, using a sealed metal case that the equipment team had reinforced specifically for this operation, welding additional bracing across the interior seams, and fitting the lock mechanism with a secondary bolt. They were proud of this case. It took the honey badger most of the night to defeat it, but by morning, the secondary bolt was on the ground, and the case was open, and the animal was outside it, sitting in the sun. On day 3, one of the soldiers, not one of the 12, a support operative working in the base camp, accidentally left the power junction panel for the forward operating base unlocked. The honey badger apparently found the panel and investigated the wiring inside it, with the same methodical thoroughness it brought to everything. And at 0340 hours, the forward operating base lost power completely, and the 12 soldiers of the task force woke up in the dark to the sound of something moving around in their supply tent. Kethros sat in the dark on the ground outside the powerless base and waited for the emergency lights to come on, and thought about his career. The power came back at 0610. 3 ration cases were gone, 1 comm unit was not working, and a fuel cell for one of the vehicles had been rolled 20 meters from the vehicle for reasons that were not clear and would never become clear. On the afternoon of day 3, Kethros went looking for the animal himself. He found it near the dry riverbed again. It was eating a cobra, a large one, thick as a forearm, and it was doing this with complete absorption, tearing the snake apart with its front claws, eating without looking up. Kethros sat down in the dirt across from it, at a distance of approximately 4 meters. He watched it eat. It did not look at him for a long time. When it did look at him, it was the same look Vel Sereth had described, flat, direct, carrying nothing in it that was afraid, or aggressive, or curious, or anything else that Kethros had a word for in his language. It was the look of something that has been on a planet for a very long time, and has never once revised its opinion of that planet, or anything on it. Kethros opened a diplomatic channel on his wrist unit. It was not connected to anything. The channel required a receiver, and the animal did not have a receiver and would not have known what to do with one. He opened it anyway. He sat there for 20 minutes while the honey badger finished the cobra, and then moved on to a scorpion it found under a rock, and then scratched itself on a thorn bush, and then found a spot of warm ground, and lay down in it with its legs spread out and its chin on the dirt. Kethros watched it lie there. It had already won, and they both understood this, or rather Kethros understood it, and the honey badger did not understand anything about it, because the honey badger did not think in terms of winning. It thought in terms of continuing, and it had continued, and it would keep continuing, and that was the whole of it. Kethros closed the diplomatic channel. He picked himself up off the ground. He filed a Priority 1 report to High Command, and in the subject line he wrote, "Recommend escalation, target uncontainable, requesting full biological review and strategic consultation." The honey badger did not watch him go. It was already asleep. The High Council of the Zelthari Dominion met in the Chamber of Assessments on the 7th day after Kethros filed his Priority 1 report. The chamber was large and circular, and the walls were covered in the records of every world the Dominion had ever catalogued, surveyed, suppressed, and absorbed. 43 worlds over 600 years, each one represented by a small glowing marker on the curved wall. The markers were green, which meant resolved, which meant manageable, which meant done. The counselors sat in a ring, and High Counselor Drevash sat at the center of that ring, the way a stone sits at the center of still water, heavy and calm and certain of its own position. She was old by Zelthari standards, old enough to have approved 2 of the 43 markers herself, and she had not convened an emergency session of the full council in 14 years. She convened one now. The report was read aloud by a junior aide who made it through the first half, without any trouble, and began to slow down in the second half, and had stopped making eye contact with anyone in the room by the time he reached the section on the Day 3 power failure and the missing ration cases. When the aide finished, Drevash looked around the ring of counselors. Nobody spoke for a moment. "A 14-kilogram animal," said Counselor Veth, who was responsible for biological assessments, and had been doing this job for 30 years, and spoke in a tone that suggested he was checking whether the number was correct, and hoping someone would tell him it was not. 14 kilograms, confirmed Orveth, who had been brought up from the planet to attend in person, and who was standing at the edge of the ring, with the look of someone who had spent several days revising their understanding of certain things. "And the reinforced containment case," Veth said. "Open by morning," Orveth said. "The suppression rod on high setting." High setting, both times. Veth sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Drevash had been reading ahead in the biological workup materials while the others talked. She was a fast reader, and she had already moved through the venom resistance data and the skin structure analysis, and had arrived at the behavioral section, which contained a subsection titled Documented Responses to Threat Stimuli. The subsection was not long, because the honest answer was that the documented responses to threat stimuli were, the animal continued doing what it was already doing. It had been attacked by lions. It had been attacked by leopards. It had been stung by bees in large numbers. It had been bitten by black mambas. It had been set upon by wild dogs. It was documented on this planet's own scientific record as having been observed being buried alive by a honey badger trap set by local humans, and digging itself back out, and walking away, and then returning the following night to dig up the trap and steal from it. That last part Drevash read twice. "Pull up the full biological database for this planet," she said. "Everything. The whole catalog. I want everything flagged that has unusual characteristics. I want it sorted by the same behavioral and physiological criteria we just reviewed, and I want it on the main screen in the next 10 minutes. The aide moved to the console. What came up on the main screen over the next 10 minutes was not comfortable viewing for a council that had spent 600 years believing it understood what kinds of planets produced what kinds of problems. The tardigrade was in there, a microscopic animal that could survive hard vacuum, radiation levels that would kill most complex organisms, temperatures at both extremes of what was survivable, and complete desiccation, and had been doing this for 500 million years. The Zelthari database had a file on it from the early drone surveys. Microscopic, no operational relevance. The crow was in there, a bird, small and light-boned and fragile-looking, with a brain that had been documented on this planet's own scientific record, using tools, recognizing individual faces, holding grudges across years, and teaching those grudges to its offspring. It was labeled non-threatening avian. The orca was in there, a large marine mammal that hunted in coordinated groups, communicated in regional dialects that differed between populations, and had been documented teaching its young specialized hunting techniques that were unique to each family group. It was labeled oceanic low priority. And then there were the humans. Drevash had been aware of the humans throughout the entire operation, in the background way that a commander is aware of a secondary objective while focused on the primary one. The humans were the ultimate target, the reason the animal suppressions were done first. Clear the way for managing the dominant species before the colonization fleet arrived. The humans were pre-interstellar. They had no beam weapons, no shielding technology, no faster-than-light capability. They were on the standard Zelthari civilization scale, early stage, and manageable. Except, Drevash looked at the cross-reference data that the console was now pulling together, and she read it with the same fast, careful attention she brought to all documents. The humans had domesticated the wolf, the apex pack predator that Squad 2 had spent 2 days carefully containing, the creature that ran in coordinated hunts and never lost a trail. The humans had taken that animal 10,000 years ago and lived with it and changed it, and now kept versions of it in their homes and fed it from their hands. There were photographs in the database of small human children sleeping on top of large domesticated wolves, without any concern from either party. The humans farmed large, dangerous animals. They kept them in enclosures and bred them, and in some cases rode on their backs for purposes that appeared to include entertainment. And then Drevash reached the part of the database that a low-level research drone had compiled from human communication networks, a section that had been filed under Cultural Practices, Miscellaneous, and never flagged for review. The humans kept honey badgers as pets. Not frequently, not widely, but documented. There were records of it, photographs of it, and in one case a short video of a human in a small living space with a honey badger sitting beside them on a flat surface, both of them looking at a screen, the honey badger occasionally leaning against the human with the relaxed weight of an animal that is comfortable. Drevash sat with this information for a long time. The chamber was very quiet. "They knew," said Counselor Veth eventually, in a voice that was not quite steady. "They have been living next to that animal for thousands of years. They knew what it was, and they chose to keep it near them." Nobody had a response to this. Drevash closed the biological workup. She closed the field reports. She closed Kethros's Priority 1 filing, and Velsaret's incident report, and Orveth's cross-referenced footnote analysis. She opened a new document. She wrote in it for 4 minutes, and then she stopped, and she read what she had written, and she did not change any of it. She sent the document to the fleet commander waiting in orbit with the colonization ships, and she sent a copy to the Dominion archives, and she sent a copy to every operational commander currently on the planet's surface. The document was not long. It said that the Earth operation was being suspended indefinitely. It said that the biological survey was being reclassified from standard pre-colonization to complex threat. It said that all field teams were to withdraw to the survey station. Within 48 hours, it said that all contained animals were to be returned to their points of origin before withdrawal was complete. At the bottom of the document, in the section reserved for command-level assessments, Drevash wrote one final line. She wrote, "This planet does not produce prey. Do not return." On the ground below, in a dry stretch of land, where the sun was heavy and the grass was pale at the tips, a small animal with black and white fur and flat dark eyes was digging at the base of a termite mound. It had found the mound an hour ago and had been working the entrance with its front claws since then, pushing dirt back between its back legs in steady rhythmic movements, entirely absorbed in what it was doing. A Zelthari transport lifted off from a clearing 2 kilometers away, rising on a column of displaced air that bent the grass flat in a wide ring around it. The noise was considerable. The light from the engines was bright, even in daylight. The honey badger did not look up. It found the termite chamber it had been digging toward, pushed its nose in, and began eating. The transport disappeared into the sky. The termite mound was more interesting anyway.